Good afternoon. Thank you for persevering and sticking with it and coming out for the last session of the day. My name is Bill Harrod. I'm an advisor in the cybersecurity practice with CA Technologies. And with me today, I am fortunate to have with me Laurie Rhea from Franchise Tax Board, the privacy officer, and Scott MacDonald from Department of Corrections. And Scott, your title is?
Agency Information Security Officer, and a few other things after that.
Right. So like many other people, Scott only wears one hat and only has one job, and no, that's not true. He wears multiple hats and has lots of jobs. So one of the things that we want to talk about today a little bit is identity is the new perimeter, is really the title of this, but we're really focused on information sharing, right? So the question is this your vision? And I apologize, the slides are kind of washed out. The projector's not quite as bright as it could be. But the idea here is to be able to provide anywhere, anytime access to your employees, employees of other agencies, vendors, partners, even citizens. More and more we are being asked to provide greater information to more types of people, to more communities, to more organizations, and really pushing information out. So citizen-facing services has become one of the buzzwords of much of what we do in federal and state and local government. So being able to take access from anywhere, at any time, from any device, and being able to grant those people access to virtually everything. Legacy applications that run on the mainframe, applications that may run natively on a smartphone or a tablet, and everything in between. And if not that, then what if we could simplify interagency information sharing? The ability to share information across agencies in a way that was easier, and yet at the same time, protect privacy, protect security, and ensure the right people have the right access to the right data, and that they only have the access that they need. We can do that, but to do it, we need a number of things. We need to be able to authenticate the users. We need to be able to make sure that we know who the user is, that we know what they ought to be able to access, and that we can have a consistent security policy enforcement across all of the types of data and applications that we're responsible for. That we can apply that access policy consistently across all users and all devices, and that we can transform legacy back-end applications and application interfaces to something that can talk to the modern technology and to where we're going, right? So as we move to a virtualized environment, as we move to a web service environment or a smart phone type of application environment, to be able to provide that sort of an application interface and still be doing it securely. And being able then to report on that usage, to be able to audit it, to be able to manage it, to be able to report on it, and meet all of our regulatory requirements as well. Yesterday when the session started, there was lots of discussions about South Carolina, right? Carlos Ramos spoke about it in his opening remarks. The gentleman from FireEye that did the keynote, he talked about it. And at this point, you guys are probably tired of hearing about South Carolina. But 6 months before the Department of Revenue breach, which is the one on the left, there was another breach in the state of South Carolina. And that was Christopher Christopher Likes Jr. is 36 years old, is a program manager who works for the state of South Carolina, and he went out and gathered together 228,000 Medicare records, collected names, dates of birth, and Medicare ID numbers. Medicare ID numbers which are the same as Social Security numbers, put them into 17 different spreadsheets and emailed them to his home address. Right? Why did he do this? He was working with somebody and they had a process set up to be able to bill Medicare based on those identities. It was intentional, it was malicious, it was lucky that they caught it. Right? And as is the case with so many of these types of exfiltrations, it wasn't until somebody outside of the state recognized it and alerted them to it that they became aware of it. So what's the point? The point is, we want to be able to share information. We want to be able to ease the information exchange between agencies and to allow citizen-facing services, and yet we still have to be able to do the right things to protect our data. But in order to be able to do that, we have to be willing to break down some walls, quite literally and figuratively. So let's look back very quickly at how we got to where we are. So I've been around security for a long time, you can tell. A long time ago, we didn't know it at the time, but security was relatively easy, right? In my early days, I ran an MVS shop. We had a raised floor, we had locked doors, and every user was at the end of a coax cable or a VTAM connection, and I knew where every one of those connections went, right? Security was relatively easy at the time. And then when we moved to the distributed environment, we built these firewalls, and we were very proud, right? The guy from FireEye yesterday talked about defense in depth, right? Man, we were proud of this bastion security model where we had the Tootsie Roll effect, right? The hard, crunchy outside and the soft, gooey center. We built firewalls, we had IDS, we had IPS, we had an impenetrable external perimeter, and everybody was inside the perimeter. And then people started to move outside the perimeter. People wanted to be mobile. People wanted to have a dial-up modem connection. People wanted to be outside of the office. Okay, still relatively easy. We create a virtual private network, a VPN link. They can be outside the firewall. All my applications are inside the firewall. I'm still good. You can see where this is going, right? Now my applications are moving outside the firewall, right? We have people using the cloud, right? Either for data storage or data file transfer, or email is moving into the cloud, or applications are moving into the cloud. Now my applications are outside my perimeter, my users are outside the perimeter, and my user base is increasing as well. Now don't get hung up on the cloud here, right? I can see some people saying, we don't use the cloud, this doesn't apply, I can tune out a little bit here. So instead of saying the cloud, for some of it, say other agency. Because just like the cloud, if I want to share information with an other agency, what do? I create user accounts for those other agency employees in my records or in my database or in my user repository. These are what we used to call shadow accounts, right? So now we have shadow accounts in other agencies that are my users or other agencies' users in my account. And so now we have identities in two different places, and we have to manage those identities in two different places. And then we have a whole new community of other users, vendors, partners, citizens. And I have to manage those identities, or someone has to manage those identities. So how do I know when that user from another agency moves to a third agency, or retires, or leaves government altogether? I don't, right? And those accounts never go away. And they stay there for a long time, and when an auditor finds it, then we're in real trouble, right? Shadow accounts, ghost accounts are going to be one of the things that auditors are looking for all the time. So we need a way of being able to identify these accounts and be able to leverage that identity really as the new perimeter. And that's what we're really talking about. The network perimeter as we knew it is gone. Between mobile devices and wireless and all of the other accesses, the old network perimeter is really a thing of the past. What we're really looking at is how do we manage identity information and how do we manage who gets access to what? Because we can no longer depend on the firewall in this concept of insider and outsider, right? Today, everybody is relatively the same, right? What's different is what they should have access to. And if I can leverage identity as the new focus of control, then I can begin to determine who gets access to what based on their identity and the identity context, right? So that might be their role, that might be some sort of job function, it may be a function of attributes or a collection of attributes, and it may be information that they give me either through a federated assertion when I ask them for information, or through attributes that either they give me or their identity provider gives to me. And we have the ability to manage that, right? So if I want attributes from a user and they say, you know, all I really want to know is when my trash is going to get picked up. I don't feel like I want to give you lots of attributes about myself, right? Maybe you need my street, maybe you need my zip code. That's all you need to tell me when my trash gets picked up. I don't need to create a whole new identity. I don't need to register a user ID and become a separate user in this environment for some sorts of things, right? So they can determine what attributes to give, and I can determine whether it's enough to make sure that I have a good concept of who the user is, a valid identity proofing of that user, and be able to grant them information based on whatever the strength of the assertion is or the strength of the identity validation and on the risk transaction or the risk value of the transaction, right? What we typically call the assurance level. And to be able to leverage that then to determine how they get access to information. So what we really want to do is we want to talk about how do we use that information, that identity, to be able to determine what we ought to be able to get access to. And being able to provide a way to be able to share information across agencies by determining who they are, what identity they've brought to me, and what the level of the transaction is that I'm willing to accept based on that based on that identity, right? So if they want to sign in with their Facebook ID, that's fine. I don't have to give it a very high credibility, but I'll take that and we can go from there, right? I have some idea who they are. And if all they want to know is when my trash gets picked up, I can provide them that information. And if they come back 6 months later and they use that same Facebook identity, I can rely on that to say, well, this was the information you gave me last time and this is a response. I'm going to use that same level of information and give you that kind of information, that sort of response. If you want something that's a higher value transaction, then we'll do some sort of step-up authentication. Maybe it's questions and answers. Maybe they're answers or questions based on information that I already have, either because of a state database that I'm looking at or because of public records. Or because of questions and answers that you've already pre-populated, just like an online banking application would do. But I have some way of being able to step up that identity, to give a higher level of credibility to it, to give a higher level of assurance to it, and to be able then to say, at this point, I know I have a stronger understanding of who you are, stronger validity, and I can provide a greater transaction value to it at that point. And to be able to wrap some risk evaluation around it as well. Have I ever seen you come from this device before? Have you already signed in another device? Right? Have you signed on recently from somewhere else? Right? So if you sign on from Sacramento at 10 o'clock in the morning and you're signing on from Beijing at 11 o'clock in the morning, we have a velocity problem. Right? In that case, I'm going to say, this is a questionable transaction. I'm going to ask you to validate your identity and provide me some greater level of assurance that I know who you are. But once we have identity, and we have a real concept of that identity, then I can base my transaction on that identity and determine what you ought to get access to. And then, either through a back-end attribute exchange, either with the user themselves or with their identity provider, I can get enough attributes to be able to understand what sort of information you ought to have access to. We see this a lot, and we're seeing it more and more, particularly as we move into the Affordable Care Act and as we move into the requirement to be able to provide fresh, real-time data between agencies. One of the things that Laurie and Scott and I were talking about is they have real requirements to be able to share information, to be able to put information up online, or to be able to put information up in a file share and have people be able to access that information and be able to rely on it. So what I'm going to ask them to do is to talk a little bit about some of the things that they're doing today, about what some of the challenges are that they face, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can address some of those, and perhaps we'll get some questions from you all as well. So, Laurie?
You don't want to go first?
I could go first.
I'm going to let Scott go.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the challenges Bill mentioned there, I mean, we've seen them all, we've experienced them, I'm sure we all do, and they still occur. I mean, you know, there was a point in time where, you know, we kind of looked at the firewalls to kind of protect our environment. You know, I'm sorry. Okay, so we looked at the firewalls to protect our environment. That's where we put most of our focus in, and you know, then we started worrying about the, you know, kind of data going in and out. You know, people bringing in personal devices. With our, you know, with our agency, we were fortunate to be able to kind of get the executive support on locking down the USB devices, putting host DLP, you know, to kind of monitoring what was going on there. You know, we figured, okay, we're pretty much getting our hands around it right now. And then, you know, all of a sudden people start bringing up mobile devices. And we're thinking, oh, geez, how are we going to control this? And I was also responsible for our e-discovery solutions, too. So we were able to take back to our cabinet, you know, hey, this presents a big problem with e-discovery. We can't really control the devices, manage devices. You know, malicious software has the ability to kind of come back into our system. And the cabinet decided, hey, we're a law enforcement agency. That's probably not in our best interest to go that way. So we think, okay, we sidestepped that one. Well, now we got new executives in. They've got iPads. They want their devices to access our IT resources. You know, so new challenges. Fortunately, you know, we always knew that this type of stuff was going to come. They want more accessibility. You know, our operation is pretty much 24/7. You know, we have to be available all the time. You know, whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, the Saturdays, the weekends, the holidays. So they need accessibility to, you know, back to our resources. So, you know, we, like I said, we knew this was coming, so we kind of try to stay in touch with technology. You know, a few years ago, more of the mobility type technologies, is expensive, you know, to kind of roll out. And there was probably only a few vendors that maybe really gave us that assurance that we really could protect the data if we actually used, you know, devices we didn't manage. I mean, there's a lot more out there now, and we are moving towards that direction and testing some things. And then, you know, we also had the remote access, you know, challenges. You know, we're implementing different systems. We've, you know, vendors come on board, systems integrators, and they say, you know, hey, we need remote access back into your system. And of course, you know, the business at that time, you know, don't really worry about the security part, sign the contracts, and then all of a sudden you find out, hey, these guys are coming in from all over the world. You know, we got guys from India, China, and everybody coming in to support the system. To think, oh man, how do we control that? You know, so that it presented additional challenges. You know, try to put access control lists in place, try to do health check monitors before they actually come in. For the most part, you know, like for our remote access solutions, we try to require, you know, state-issued devices. Of course, you know, then we start moving more towards teleworkers. Okay, well, we can't issue everybody a laptop device out. So then we say, okay, we need some more like Citrix type environments. So, you know, we implemented some VDI using two-factor authentication, which pretty much allows them to work within the environment. doesn't actually allow them to transfer any files back and forth, except if you're using the VPN, which has to be on a state-issued device, which we do two-factor authentication there as well using certificates. So, if somebody's obtained your credentials through some keyloggers type stuff, at least we could kind of restrict it to those devices and everything. Nothing's perfect, but it kind of gives a little bit of more of assurance level. So, the network started opening more and more up. And then we got hit with, I'm sure a lot of you heard in the papers, AB 109, the realignment. So kind of sending as prisoners released, typically they'd be under parole supervision. Now they go out to the county supervision, which required us to provide them that information now to do their jobs at the county. So we're thinking, okay, we're tightening up all this offender data, putting DLP rules in place. Now they're saying, no, you got to give it to pretty much everybody now. It's going out to all 58 counties. It's going to, the governor's office. It's going to attorney generals, DOJs. And we already had given some information out to, we have a pro lead system, which has a lot of pro lead type data that we allow them back access in. And actually we do that through authenticating back into a totally separate forest, Active Directory domain, so we didn't actually have to put those user accounts within our environment. So it kind of gives us some level of protection, and then kind of get some delegation of account management out there. But as over time, the network, the boundaries just dissolve. You got to come up with other solutions. We're looking at different rights management, DRM type protection ability on the documents. And then it rolls into into cloud services. Now you don't have all your data actually within your own environment. You don't manage it all. It's actually going out to the cloud. And there's some advantages going to the cloud. So like there, we look at the classification of the data that's actually being moved out there. We haven't really moved any of our offender data out there. They have probably stricter requirements. CJIS compliance around offender data. There's really not too many providers out there that really meet those requirements at this time. So that's pretty much contained internally. But for who knows what that'll look like in the future, and as IT resources become, budgets get cut, we look at more efficient ways to do things. Sometimes cloud service is a more cost-effective solution right there. And then as we start moving this data outside our environment, and something Laurie is going to talk a little bit about too, is the need for established strong agreements and data sharing agreements with your partners out there. We've provided, set up systems to share data with all 58 counties. That took a lot of legal, going back and forth there. That could be challenging at times. You kind of getting agreements on both sides, but we've overcome that. Actually, we stood up the solution to share the data with the counties. It took us about a month to get everybody on board, and with the legal, the legal agreement. That took over a year to get that in place. So that could be challenging right there. But I think we've got some standardized language now that we're able to use across most of our agreements that really kind of help us speed up this thing. But yeah, like the boundaries have dissolved. Your data is going all over the place. It's trying to keep track of where it is. The agreements, the indemnification clauses that are bound to that. And knowing who's, basically who's on the other side there and how they're handling the data.
Yeah, it sounds like, what you're talking about, Scott, is exactly what Bill was talking about. The boundaries have dissolved. So I'm the privacy officer at Franchise Tax Board. So when I think about my biggest challenge, for example, when we talk about sharing data, and I'm thinking about the slide that Bill talked about, maximizing the data that we have and sharing that with other entities and other agencies so that we benefit all of the state of California. When I think about that, that's where my privacy hat, my ears go up and the hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I'm just kind of like, oh my gosh, how do I do this? How do I do my job maintaining the confidentiality and privacy of that personal information that I have, that I am custodian of? How do I do that when I'm also called and mandated to share that data all over the place? And there are mandates in place for us to do this. It's not that I really have a choice. So when I think about that challenge, you know, Franchise Tax Board currently has more than 200 data exchange agreements in place. That includes numerous state agencies. It includes the federal government. It's just, we're sharing data because we're mandated to do so. And I'm also taking custody of data from those other entities in many cases. In addition to that, we have two agencies, our sister tax agencies, if you will, who actually have online access into our legacy systems. So, so we're talking about how do we authenticate those users who are not really in our Active Directory. They're not on our network. They have a user ID now because we have to create one in order to allow them access to our online system. But how do I manage Scott at his department when I don't know what Scott's business is? You know, Scott's liaison with me says, yep, here's these 5 people. They all need access to this data. Okay, that's today. What about next month? What about next year when Scott gets a promotion and isn't working in that level, in that business anymore, and doesn't need access to the data? How do I know that? How do I ensure that I am notified that that user should now be cut off from the system? So these are some things that we try to address through our interagency agreement process. We've got some really strong language about business need and justification for that data access. We've got some really strong language about notification when users change. We also go through a process where if a user doesn't use their account, doesn't use their user ID to access the data in a certain period of time, 30 days, whatever it is, we just disable the account. So we have taken some proactive steps so that if Scott changes jobs and no longer has a business need for that data, at least we're taking some proactive steps to just get rid of the user, because I don't want it just hanging out there, right? Part of the challenge with this is that mandate to share information and that desire to really leverage that information over the state, to increase revenues across the board. It's a lengthy process. Scott talked about, we're able to implement a solution, a technology solution in a month, but to get the data contract through, legal and security and risk assessments and security safeguard reviews where we really want to look at the other entity's system and what are they doing with the data if we're exchanging data, takes a long time. We typically allow 9 months just to effect and execute one data exchange contract. It's a really, really cumbersome process. So that identity then, if we're going through all that difficulty and all that effort up front to put a strong security, what we say is a strong security and safeguard program in place before we exchange that data, we better come up with some really good ways to ensure the identity of the people that are having access to that data. We do a lot of monitoring of user accesses, but when I'm sending a file, a data file, and I'm putting it out in our secure web transfer protocol, and I say, okay, it's out there, you can pick it up now. The other agency comes in, picks up that file. Now, who has access to that file? I haven't validated any of their users, right? I know who their liaison is. I know who the technical person is who can pick up that file. But how do I know when that person changes? So it's, and I don't have answers. I'm certainly not up here as an expert to give you the answers, but I really think that's where this symposium comes in, right? That's where the benefit comes from. So I really challenge you all to kind of let's engage in a discussion here about how we resolve those issues. How do we address those questions? How do we manage remote users or remote employees of other agencies who have access to our data? Because we're all sharing data. I don't think anybody's working in a real isolated environment anymore. So.
And I don't know about how Scott and Laurie are managing user accounts for people that come in. But one of the things that I've seen in a number of places that I've done work is that when people go out and create that new account, what do? What are your users going to do? They're going to use a user ID that they know, probably the one that they're already using on your agency, and they're going to use a password that they can remember, probably the password they're using on your agency. So now that user ID and password resides in multiple places. And all that has to happen is for that user ID and password to get compromised in one place, and we go back to the South Carolina Department of Revenue, where somebody got a single user ID and password, used it to gather user IDs and passwords for a number of system administrators, and then compromised a whole series of Citrix servers to be able to gather all of the records that the South Carolina Department of Revenue lost. So, how do we do it, right? We'll take some questions, but one of the things that Scott touched on that I think is important is that we need to have a way of doing true multi-factor authentication and strong risk-based authentication. We also need to have a way, because it's not just, as Laurie talked about, putting information up there and having somebody come get that information off a file share, right? We're moving to machine-to-machine communication. Those are now happening in web services. I've done some work with the Federal Student Aid, Free Application for Federal Student Aid, FAFSA. When you sign on to FAFSA, one of the things that it asks you for is it asks you for your adjusted gross income from the previous year's tax filing. When you put that information in, there is a machine call that goes out to IRS, validates that, says, does this number match? Gives them the information that they need, user ID or username, password, username, social security number, date of birth, and we'll match that against the tax record. That's all done as a machine call. There isn't anybody that's sitting there doing that. So we now need a way of being able to authenticate and authorize those machine-to-machine calls as well. One of the ways that we can start to address some of this is to build a maturity model and to develop a strategy. This is one. This does not necessarily represent your environment, or it's not necessarily even the right maturity model for you. But this is one that I've used with some agencies that I've worked with. In the first stage in the maturity model, what we're really doing is looking at building an identity management and governance process. And this is identity for not only all of the users, but all of the applications and machines as well. So all of those service accounts, all of those web service accounts have an identity as well. And then be able to provide content-aware authentication, single sign-on, particularly for web applications, and federation, so that we don't have to create those separate user accounts. I can federate that identity and become an identity provider to other agencies, and they can rely on it. Again, going back to that service agreement that we create. So if I authenticate at my agency and then am federated over, the receiving agency can say, I already know that this is coming from tax. I know that Bill is signed on. He's already authenticated strongly. I'll accept this, again, for certain types of transactions at certain levels. And then to be able to provide an extended access control and a consistent security policy across all of my applications, and really be able to provide information sharing from agency to agency, and being able to keep that information fresh and relevant, and having a concept of that identity-aware context so that when people leave, I don't have to worry about that shadow account residing out there. I just no longer have the federated identity that gets presented to me. Questions?
Yeah, I do. You talked about process to remove that shadow account. What sort of processes, other than like a documented business process, have you encountered for that?
So the question is, when we do have shadow accounts, what is the process to remove those? Do you all do anything?
Well, I can tell you internally, and where we do actually have 80 accounts running, what we do is every few months we actually run some scripts, and we could actually see which accounts have been used. And then we kind of give them a grace period, and if that account isn't used within that grace period, or they haven't come back to we require whoever administrates that business unit to actually flag, within AD, the reason this isn't being used, whether it be because they're out of medical or whatever. And if nobody's identified it and it remains like what we call a stale account, we kind of stamp it. Then what we do is we actually delete it from our environment at that time.
You're using an auto script in AD to look for that activity.
Correct. Mm-hmm. But we're kind of dependent upon it's like they always say, is you're only as strong as your weakest link, and so you got to depend upon your partners and everybody to kind of follow the procedures and stuff, and past experience too. Like one of our major, like our parole system that we share with all the law enforcement agencies. We had reports in the past where the FBI, every once in a while they intercept these keylogger files. And we've had, law enforcement individuals show up, their accounts had been compromised, and, even as a law enforcement individual, we've got to cut them off and stuff. So, like I said, you're only as strong as your weakest link there.
I was going to say, one of the things that I've seen is when an employee goes from spot to spot to spot and they have extended access to stuff that they no longer should.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And one of the things that we see often is when people move from one function, one role to another, right? It's what we call a collector. They end up getting new accesses, new entitlements, and they never relinquish anything, right? Because I may need that again at some point, right? And don't take away access to this Unix box and then come to me on some Friday afternoon and ask me to fix something after you've taken that account away. Right? So we end up with these people that are collectors. That really is a part of the identity governance piece of this, right? Being able to validate that people have access that they need and nothing else, and that they only have the access that they need. Within the federal space, part of their requirements are every 6 months to go through a certification process of all users, so that every manager is responsible for all of their reports to validate that they only have access to what they need and nothing else. The other side of that is that application owners are required to validate that everybody that has access to the business application that they're responsible for has a need to have that access. There is no way for that business owner to know all of those individuals, right? So part of that is we need to be able to delegate that out. We need to have a way of being able to provide an automated function to delegate that responsibility out to their managers and have them do that. And it's a part of good governance, and then be able to go out and correlate accounts so that I can validate that accounts have been used within a reasonable amount of time. And if we no longer have to create those individual accounts on all of the different systems, or external users in my system and shadow accounts, right? If we really move to a strong federation model, then the identity provider, hopefully their agency is that identity provider, the identity provider is responsible for that, and that gives me the ability to leverage that.
Well, I was going to comment on his, that like an employee can have a shadow or account that's inactive for a period of time, but in IT, you're not going to know whether or not that person was placed on administrative leave, and you go litigation hold, which now you have to freeze that account, because that can cost the organization tons of money. If you don't know and just automatically delete that, then you need that for that case.
And many agencies never delete accounts. Many agencies will move accounts into an inactive OU and hold that. And we have some ways of being able to do that. I spent 14 years in federal law enforcement, and thanks to Robert Hansen, I will guarantee you they can go back and tell you what anybody had access to on any given time today. They couldn't then, right? But they now we no longer delete accounts, we move accounts into an inactive state. But you're right, we have to be able to go back and do that.
And that's what we would just disable the account, so it's not deleted, it's just kind of put away, put in a drawer, cut off the access. The other thing, we use the cybersecurity month, if you will, to prompt all of our management throughout our department to reevaluate user access. So every year in October, an automated message goes out to all of our management that says, here's all your people, you need to make certain that they've got access to what they need. So
There was another question?
Question in regards to, we always talk about these accounts, and what I don't get is, why don't we have HR trigger these? We always talk, I mean, we always put out like...
We actually do that on our side. We do identity access management. So anytime actually anybody comes into our HR system, or we pull the records from SEO and stuff, it automatically creates an Active Directory account. And then we place additional entitlements because, you try to use roles. Our major systems, we use, role-based authentication, put them into groups. We have correctional officers. So, obviously, just based upon their classification, they actually have these privileges and rights to do it. However, there's always additional entitlements because not every correctional officer or business analyst does the same thing or needs access to the same information. So we do have some automated processes we do not actually create new accounts anymore. They're automatically created. We're working on the deprovisioning process, which is, that's a little more challenging. And the problem is the SEO and, the systems and stuff, a lot of times positions are, they're pretty much already on site before they're actually in the, actually have a position number. So that creates some challenges right there too.
In an effective identity and access management system, you would have a feed that comes directly from HR that would create new accounts and would deprovision accounts when people leave or change roles. And those types of things exist. But the problem is, what happens when you're not part of the HR system for that other agency, right? So Scott in corrections is not in the HR system for the Franchise Tax Board, but he needs access there, right? So that's when we have sort of this breakdown in the identity management workflow, right? And that's why being able to leverage a strong authentication and a federated identity gives us a stronger model than having to create those shadow accounts. Other questions? We have a number of solutions that will address this, and I'd be happy to talk to people more about this afterwards. I'd like to thank Scott and Laurie for helping us out today, and thank you guys for coming.